Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode I'm going to be looking at this Hornby Princess Royal Loco that's been sent to me by Mick, and he would like me to restore it to running order. Now it's come to me in a multitude of parts with a bag full of bits, but I'm pretty certain we can restore this Loco to running order as it all seems to be there. I'm not quite sure what's happening with the Loco chassis here. Somebody has attempted to reassemble that, but they've put it on the wrong way. The pony wheels and front pony truck and a load of screws are in that bag. That's part of the boiler detail. And Mick did say that the tender body shell was stuck to the chassis. Now, it does appear to be very tight. A battery test on the tender proves that it's not drawing any power, or it's not got any life in it at all. So after some thinking about it and some careful work with a flat-ended screwdriver in the hole at the front of the tender there, the tender body shell was stuck fast, and I was beginning to think it had been super glued on. But with the aid of a blunt scalpel blade and the flat-bladed screwdriver, I eventually managed to pop it off the chassis. But it was very, very tight. Now, I don't think anybody's been in here since this left the Margate factory, probably in the late 1980s. But popping the tender body off, we can find the normal ring-filled motor setup. There's some dust and fluff in here and bits of old cardboard by the look of it. But a battery across the motor terminals, there's no life in this whatsoever. It is making a funny noise, but there's no life in it. So I'm going to strip this down. The first thing you have to do is to unhook the wires and then remove these two tender weights. It's not just these two tender weights that hold this motor in these tender frames. There is a screw underneath of the Fowler version, which we're working on here, so that needs to be removed. And then the ring-filled motor setup can be removed. Now you have to remove this tender drawbar piece. Now this wedges in quite firmly, but then the motor is released. It's funny, this must have been a Friday afternoon job, as the centre floating wheel on one side only is a solid disc wheel, not a spoked wheel as it should be. So I'm going to open this up by disengaging these tabs on the back of the ring-filled motor plate, and we'll have a look at the inside. Now when I open it up, it's very dry, there's no lubrication, there's obviously some carbon marks on that commutator. But when I start to clean the commutator, I noticed a problem, and I've never seen this before on a ring-filled motor. The fact that the commutator seems to have crazed. It's almost like the brass has cracked, or there's something gone on in here. It could have overheated, I'm not entirely sure, but I clean it up anyway with my usual method of a cotton bud and meths fiberglass pencil, and then clean out the gaps with a cocktail stick, and you can see there that there is quite a lot of carbon build-up. But then when I look at the motor faceplate itself, like I said, it's very dry. There's no lubrication on here whatsoever. I mean, some of these are absolutely caked in carbon deposits, but this one is very, very dry. There's hardly anything on it whatsoever. So going back to that commutator faceplate, there is obviously something not quite right with that, and I am a bit concerned that that's going to impede its running in the future. But we'll rebuild it anyway and see how we get on. So I'm just going to put a tiny amount of lubrication on that gear spindle and the armature shaft there, just where it goes through the brass bearing in the faceplate, and the motor faceplate was put back on. The brushes were cleaned and the springs were cleaned, and these are now put back in place in the brush retainers. And now when I give it a battery test, the motor spins into life, but it is making a very strange sound, and it's not the usual screeching sound that's associated with dry bearings. It's almost like an electrical hum. But I'm taking the cogs off the back now, just to give all this a clean up with a cotton bud and meths. But again, there's very little in the way of dirt. It's more dust and fluff on this model rather than actual old dirt and grease. Same with the gears. It's one of the driest and cleanest ring-filled motors I've ever worked on. So once everything was given a thorough cleaning, I put a small amount of silicone grease lubricant on the gear spindles just to make sure that everything is correctly lubricated, because like I said, there was no lubrication on this model whatsoever. and the gears are then put back into place. There's two smaller gears sit on the lowermost spindles, and then the bigger gears with the small gear cast in the rear sit on the uppermost spindles and engage with the worm cog off the actual motor shaft. And then the brass retaining clip, which has also been cleaned, is then put back into place. So a battery test again, make sure all the cogs are meshing fine, and the motor is running, although now it's starting to emit a very strange smell as well. So I'm getting the impression this motor may have been under either immense load or has got extremely hot by being seized up. I'm not entirely sure, but we'll persevere with it for now. I clean the wheels on the tender while it's out of the tender frame, and then the tender frame itself again is very relatively clean. This was just given a dust off with an old makeup brush, and then it's time to put the tender motor back into the tender motor block back into the tender chassis. This is just engaged with those two clips. That's a push fit. The tender drawbar, I'm going to polish this up with a fiberglass pencil. It's a brass part, so the cleaner it is, the better it will be for electrical conductivity. So you can see there, just polishing it with a fiberglass pencil, just how nice and shiny this piece will show up if a little bit of work's put onto it. And once it's been cleaned, this is manipulated back into place. Now it is quite a fiddly job. It only just fits through that armature, but you've got to get it at the right angle so that the tender drawbar sits through, otherwise it can get stuck. The rear screw was then replaced to hold the motor mount into the tender chassis. Then the two big weights were replaced inside the actual tender shell itself, and all of the wires were then reconnected to the brush terminals, and that tender shell snaps back in place. Now that's not going anywhere anytime soon. That is one of the tightest ring-filled tenders I've ever had to deal with. It's very, very tight on there. The rear coupling was then replaced on the tender. Now that's done, I'm going to turn my attention to the Loco section. Now this chassis keeper plate here has been put on the wrong way around, so disengaging the two clips, I gently pull that away. I have to disengage the pickups there, and then the pickup wire, which seems to be tangled around the axles, is unthreaded. The axles are all, and there's the wire. And the axles have got proper bearings on them. So these are manipulated back in place just to see how free running this is, because this was not free running when I received it. So all them bearings are in place, and it is very free running. But again, like the tender, this is extremely dry. And you look at this cotton bud now, I'm wiping out the axle holes and bearings, and there's absolutely no dirt. There's no congealed oil, no nothing. It's absolutely bare. The only dirt coming off it is dust. So now I've got all the dust off, I'm going to give these axles a small spot of oil from this Fleischmann pin dropper that I've got here. And then the wheels are tested to make sure they are free running, which they are. The wheel treads themselves are given a clean up. There is a bit of carbon build up on the wheel treads. This model has obviously seen some use in the past. But it all comes off easy enough with a cotton bud and meths. There's no need for the fiberglass pencil. So now the Loco wheels have been freed up and lubricated. The chassis keeper plate is clipped back into place. There's two clips at the front and one at the rear. And then I've cleaned the pickup parts there with a fiberglass pencil, and these slide down very gently through openings in that chassis keeper plate, and they are engaged in the top. These are push against the wheel backs, and then this wire clips onto the brass part that also forms part of the securing screw. Now that just sits on there. When you do that, make sure that's not touching the tender chassis sides, as it sometimes can cause a short circuit. It's surprising the amount of drag those two pickups have added to this these driving wheels, because before they were very free running, but now it's got those against it. it has got quite a little bit of drag, and it now makes a rubbing noise with the brass rubbing on the wheelbacks. This boiler piece clips into the body shell one way. It narrows towards the front, and then once that's in place, it's a case of engaging the rear clip under the cab and pushing the Loco chassis home, and that fits in place nicely, and the wheels are all still free turning. Now, looking at the bag of screws, there are two silver small screws in here. These go into the chassis keeper plate and screw into the chassis just to hold the keeper plate in place in case those plastic clips should break. And then the next is the rear pony truck. Now this goes in here with that screw and spring connection, but the wheel has come adrift in transit, and the wheel, this is just a silver seal wagon wheel. This is all this is, with the pinpoint axle. So this was given a clean up with a cotton bud and meths, and then so was the tender connection, like I did with the tender drawbar pin. This connector was also polished up with a fiberglass pencil to make sure the brass was nice and clean. And then the wheel is manipulated. Sorry about that, my microphone died. But yeah, the wheel's manipulated into the pony wheel there. You do have to bend the axle slightly, but it is plastic and it will flex a little to allow you to put that in. So once that's in, the pony wheel is then secured to the chassis. Make sure the spring is on that screw and you don't lose it, because that is essential for holding the pony wheel on the rails, and it also helps conduct the electricity. The next screw out the bag was the body securing screw. Now this goes through the chassis into the body shell and secures the chassis and body shell together. And then, having been cleaned, the front pony wheel is then put in place with the last remaining screw. And I don't know why, but I was holding the model upside down at this point. It didn't occur to me to put it in my Loco cradle like I have it here, when I put a small amount of oil on those front axles in that pony wheel there. And whilst the oil pot is out, I'm also going to put a tiny amount of oil on all the linkages and crank pins to make sure it runs as freely and as smoothly as possible. So now that's all done, I'm just going to give the body shell a final dusting, and then we'll give this model a battery test to see if our rebuild has been complete, or successful, should I say. So putting on a small length of track, I connect the Loco and tender together, and fingers crossed we have a runner. But now I know none of you crossed your fingers, because we don't have a runner. This is when the model decided to give up the ghost. Nothing I did power-wise would get the model to fire into life. So initially I thought there may have been a short circuit of the driving wheels on the Loco in the wrong way around, but having checked where the pickups are, everything looked okay. Now, putting a lead from my controller with crocodile clips onto the tender does spark into life, although there is a horrid electrical smell and it is making a very strange noise. So I'm just testing the connections here to make sure that everything is connecting and transferring power as it should be. But the motor now, the ring-filled motor in the tender, is refusing to start unless I turn the model with the power applied. Then the motor will kick into life. So I believe one of the coils may have burnt out. And I'm just checking those pickups there, and I can confirm that the pickups on the Loco are in the correct place. They are shorting out where they should do. I should have used a multimeter on that, but instead I just used those leads. Don't follow my example. So I stripped the motor down again, and it did really smell. With the battery test, it wouldn't even turn the motor over now. As you'll see in a minute when I take the faceplate back off, the commutator is very clean. But that crazing on the commutator that I mentioned earlier, I mean, you can't really see it on the video, it doesn't pick it up, but I'll give you a close-up still shot, and you can see the lines in the brass there. And I also noticed that one of the coils, the solder joint, has broke to one of the coils, and the coil has a very, very bad smell to it. So I stripped that motor block down and got a new one. It had to be a specific motor block for this model, a very low model with it being a Fowler tender. And these coils on this are good. That one is fit for the bin. I will remove the armature and just keep the motor case in. So here we have the time-lapse footage of me rebuilding the replacement motor block. This was done exactly the same as we detailed earlier on. Everything was built up. The tender was rebuilt exactly the same way. All the wiring then was put back on, the weights, etc. And then you'll see a massive difference. Now, before, a battery wouldn't turn this Loco over, but now she sits on the workbench again with the battery on the test track and she fires straight into life. Now, some people might think, well, that's not very fast, but the battery is dying. I've just bought myself a new one. But that is worlds away from what it was before. It wouldn't even move itself before. So there was definitely something wrong with that armature in that model. So now that's running, the tender body shell is snapped back in place for a second and hopefully final time. And that is Mick's Princess Royal with a Fowler tender fully restored to working order. And what a handsome model it is. Now, I'm a bit of an LNER man, being brought up on the East Coast, but you've got to admit these Stanier Princesses were absolute behemoths of locos. Even more so with the Stanier tender, and they are very handsomely proportioned engines, especially in this LMS Crimson Lake. So James's DC layout is no more. He has got rid of it, so I am restricted to running this on my dining room table, but we will follow up on James's model progress in future videos. If you've got an engine you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Track to Track, please email me at dansmodelrailways@gmail.com and we'll have a look at getting it sent over, and it may even feature in an episode all of its own. I'm happy we've managed to restore Mick's Princess Royal to running order, and I will get this sent back to him now. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you again in the next video. Bye for now.